Tervetuloa uuden jaksoon ja nyt päästään kuulkaa ammattilaisen kanssa keskustelemaan vähän brisketin tekemisestä.
My name is Bill Dumas, otherwise known as the Sausage Sensei, here in beautiful Seguin, Texas. We're here in the main pit area here at our restaurant at Schultz's Pit Room, as I mentioned in Seguin. So yeah, we're going to be talking about a few things brisket, yes?
What about how many brisket you have done in your life?
Oh my goodness, that's a lot, man. I've done a lot. I don't know. I've been in the barbecue industry professionally for about 15 years. Prior to coming here at Schultz's, I was at Brotherton's Black Iron Barbecue in Pflugerville, Texas, and then at Style Switch Barbecue in Austin, Texas. Style Switch probably being one of the ones where we did the highest amount of volume. I think our average cook per day was anywhere between 80 to 100 briskets a day. At Brotherton's, we were probably at about 30 to 35 briskets a day. Here at Schultz, that kind of depends on load versus catering, but we're probably somewhere within that 35 to 50 briskets a day, depending upon catering, give or take. So if you add all that up times 15 years, times 2 briskets per cow, that's a lot of cows, man. A lot.
Yeah.
Tons.
You also mentioned about the biggest catering gig what you have, so there was a couple of people.
Yeah, actually, yes. Here at Schultz's, we do a lot of catering. Speaking of Schultz, so the Schultz family own this beautiful restaurant here in Seguin, but they also have a sister restaurant in beautiful Rosenberg, Texas. In Rosenberg, they really made a name for themselves in respect to catering, and I do mean thousands upon thousands of people for each catering job. And it's no different here. We picked up, I'm not going to name names, but we picked up a big catering in the month of December that's going to challenge us just a wee little bit. I believe the number on that is about 2,500 people on that catering. That's more than a few. And I think the spread on that is brisket, our mild or regular sausage, and if memory serves me correctly, it's either pork ribs or turkey, but I have to get back to you on that. So catering is a huge part of our business here.
Well, what about speaking about the history of the brisket and there are like the old ways and the modern ways to brisket, so...
Yeah, well, as I mentioned before, brisket is the belle of the ball, so it's the most important protein on any barbecue menu, especially here within the state of Texas. And when we're talking about the state of Texas, we're talking about Central Texas barbecue. And when we're talking about Central Texas barbecue, we're talking about what is known as market style barbecue. And what I mean by that is a lot of the outfits, especially a lot of the older establishments here within the state, are derived directly from Bohemian and Bavarian influences. For example, truck with loud pipes. You got to have that in Texas. If you don't have a truck with loud pipes, you're not a real Texan, right?
Yeah.
Case in point. So nonetheless, some of the older establishments within the area that are directly Bohemian and Bavarian derived, such as Kreitz Market, that's spelled K-R-E-U-Z, but pronounced Kreitz Market, has been in operation since 1900. So a lot of the folks that came and helped settle Central Texas, coming from what would become Germany or Czechoslovakia or Austria or Hungary, if you look around us, all around this area, there are towns with the names of Davina, Praha, Velder, Fredericksburg, and so on and so forth. So you can tell that these people came from over there. But what they had to do when they got here, has butchers, has folks in agriculture, in respect to butchery and how to put things on the plate, they had to adjust what they were doing in the old world versus here. And very quickly they discovered, particularly during Reconstruction after the American Civil War, that it was more profitable for them to smoke the meats and sausages as it was to sell them raw, based on the heat and the humidity and the climate that we have here in Texas, because it's really hot. So that became a profitable extension of their business. And in the case of Kreitz and a lot of the other businesses around, they just segued directly into that. And back in the olden days, brisket was not on really anybody's menu. Brisket have, from a packer standpoint, generally went to the Northeast, somewhere in New England or New York, for example, and they went to a lot of kosher menus and for corned beef and things of that nature. What people predominantly focused upon here was navel plate or shoulder clod. If you go to some of the older establishments today, shoulder clod is still important on the menu, navel plate to a lesser extent, but it's still out there and still on menus. But brisket really wasn't part of anyone's menu until the advent of what we call, or what I call rather, the industrialization and mechanization of agricultural methodologies, i.e. box beef, where everything comes to you from the packer in a box. And that kind of segued towards a cheaper way of doing things, which by extension was more profitable for the businesses. And slowly over time, the brisket became the important part of the menu. But nowadays, modern day standards, what we're dealing with is an elevation and refinement of those old philosophies and methodologies. And that's really happened within the last 15 or 20 years. Boy, that's a lot right there.
Yeah. Well, speaking about the brisket, so what about if we start about the meat? So what meat you prefer and why?
Well,
quality, I think.
As far as quality, well, there's different classifications and grades within the U.S. Grading system. And you have to remember that when the USDA is grading meats, they're grading it specifically from the ribeye itself. The carcass is not graded on any other cut of meat, right? But on that ribeye. So just to kind of simplify it, we have a few different grades. We have no roll, which means no grade. It usually goes towards ground beef and other things. Then we have select, and we're all talking about marbling. When we're talking about grades, we're talking about the amount of internal fat within the carcass or the subprimal, primal or subprimal, the amount of marbling contained within that product or that particular cut of meat. So that's what it's graded upon, is that ribeye. So we have the no roll, we have the select, which is the least amount of marbling. Then we move up in grade with a higher degree of marbling to choice, and then we move up further to prime. But there are subsets that the USDA and the packers have created between grading. So now we have no roll, select, choice, upper 2/3 choice, which is just under prime, and then we have prime, and then we have upper 2/3 prime, which is prime of the prime. Now, that doesn't necessarily fall within the paradigm of Wagyu and other specialty cuts like that, because it's own separate, dare I say, grading system, such as A1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is a little bit different. But those are the basic classifications. What we prefer, now every restaurant's going to preference in respect to what grading they like. We like to run upper 2/3 choice up into prime, because the amount of marbling contained within that product is going to be more pronounced on the upper 2/3 prime or the prime versus cost, because we also have to factor in cost and what we're going to move that product to our customers at. So that's what we like to run, and we believe that has the right amount of marbling for render, which means a moist brisket.
What is the difference between Wagyu and prime? Can you tell?
Oh boy, that's a whole big difference. So that's a whole,
shortly.
that's a whole nother thing, because you have to remember Wagyu has its own breed, which is Japanese descendant, right? Which comes from Japan, and they're babied, they're even fed sake and maybe even massaged. I want to be a Wagyu cow, that's for sure. If I'm going to be eaten, I want to be Wagyu. But it's a very nice marbling, and there's different gradings, A1 through 5, if memory serves me correctly. And the Wagyu cuts are extremely well marbled, and not the type of fat that we're talking about in respect that it's gristle or an unappetizing bite. We're talking fat that's like butter, like meat butter. And the higher in pronunciation of fat concentration, i.e. marbling, the better it eats. Now, what we're dealing with here on this side of the house is a little bit different. We're talking about what's called packer briskets. And the packer briskets, it means exactly that. It comes from the packer, right? Identified by grade accordingly, put in a box, and off we go. So therein the two worlds don't really meet. if I were going to operate on 100% Wagyu, but bearing in mind also the Wagyu eats, its mouthfeel is a whole lot different. And the quality of the fat in respect to how it spreads across the palate is a whole lot different than what we have with just regular commodity grade Packer briskets. They don't eat the same, nor is the fat rendering the same, nor is the mouthfeel the same. I don't think there's any barbecue restaurant that could remain profitable and run 100% Wagyu. It's just not possible. Now, on the competition side of the house, that's a little bit different. We were talking about quote unquote one bite barbecue, and there you have it. That's a whole different thing. So I don't know if that answers your question, but maybe.
Can you give some example? What are the best way to trim the brisket?
Well, I don't have a raw brisket in front of me, but what I do have is one that'll come off the pit. We can kind of use that as an example. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's okay.
And then maybe we can wrap it too. What do you think?
Yeah.
Okay, let's do that. And I can show you what we're looking for.
Yeah.
Let me grab one. So I'll just use this one. Let me grab that. Close that. I'll just use this one as an example, if we will, and I can kind of show you what it is. So remember, a brisket comes from this part on the cow, right? So it's the chest, and there's 2 briskets per cow. They're laid side by side like bookends. So you have up here what I call the pectoral hump, or the moist cut, and then we have the lower end of it, which would be the lean cut. And the brisket, they're bearing in mind, they're side by side like bookends, right? But when we get down here towards the lean part, we're extending down into the navel, or the navel plate. So that's going to be very lean. Now, those 2 muscle groups, the point and the flat, they overlap one another. And because it's 2 muscles that are overlapped, supporting the bulk of the weight of the cow on the front end, we discussed earlier, probably about 50 to 60% of the weight of the cow on the front end, we know that that's a tough muscle. Even though, even on a higher grade of marbling, it's still going to take a long time to cook and render that fat out. Make sense? Yeah. So when we're talking about trimming this guy, we need to institute what I coin as the block trim. And what I mean by that is we're shortening up the brisket up off that navel plate and reducing the amount of pectoral hump and reducing the amount of concentration on the upper fat cap and reducing the amount of decal on the bottom of the brisket. So if we use this one for an example, and I hope your camera can pick it up from here, yes? So what we're dealing with here is what I call a block trim. So if this brisket right here were just right out of the package, i.e. a Packer brisket, this lean part for where my right hand is could extend all the way out to here. Okay, then we have a lean end on this side, which is, a lean end on this side right here, and then we have our fat end over here, which is where the decal is on the bottom side. And then of course we have our point and our flat, as I discussed earlier just a moment ago. So that's how this guy is. What we want to do is we want to manipulate this cook. Manipulation is key, because we need to reduce the amount of waste on the block, right? Because we don't want to serve our customers things that we don't want to eat, right? We have to make it correct. So we have to manipulate this guy on how he cooks properly out here. So we have to trim it accordingly. Also, we need to manipulate it so it will cook evenly on this pit overall. So those are our parameters. So if I'm going to take and use this brisket as an example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to shorten up the tail and I'm going to round it out on this side right here. So I'm going to reduce any thin spots, because I would have a thin spot on this corner and I'd have a sharp point on this corner of the flat. So I'm going to round it out and make it aerodynamic, to coin a phrase, and reduce that thin spot and reduce that sharp point and reduce that flat coming in this direction towards the point. Okay. Then I'm going to take my fat cap and I'm going to shave it down to 1/4 of an inch, but only after I reduce the amount off this pectoral hump, also called the mohawk. So we're going to trim that down. And as you can see, we're trimming this way and this way. So when the fat renders, it'll roll off of it. Yeah. Then we're going to flip it over and we're going to reduce the amount of decal. That's that hard heel fat underneath it. And we're going to reduce and remove any silver skin that may be inherent on that bottom side. Now, as I mentioned, this is what we call, or I call, a block trim. And the person that developed this was probably the most famous person, the most influential person, in my view, that you probably never heard of. And his name is Fred Fontaine. And Fred Fontaine worked at Louis Miller Barbecue from about 1951 until about 94, 95 upon his retirement. And Mr. Fontaine developed this trim after trial and error, cooking on those big brick pits that they have at Louis Miller with no temperature gauges. And that was a way that he developed to make those briskets cook a little bit easier and a little bit more consistently. Now, bearing in mind, there's been an elevation and refinement over these trimming methods. And we have to give credit where credit is due. And within the last 15 or 20 years, those two people that have really given the rise in respect to craft barbecue are two people. It began with John Miller, M-U-L-L-E-R, M-U-E-L-L-E-R, of the Louis Miller dynasty and family, Louis Miller Barbecue, John Miller, and then, as a matter of consequence and by proxy, Aaron Franklin, and everybody else afterwards. But everybody else is pretty much doing the same thing, including ourselves. It's all about yield. Let me back up a half step. It's about manipulation of the product to get it cooked evenly and consistently versus yield on the block.
Okay, yeah. What about shortly about the seasoning? So
Yep.
what is here example?
Yeah, the seasoning here, this is basically, a lot of folks will say salt and pepper only, and salt and pepper only has been the gold standard for years and years and years, much longer than I've been alive. But there is salt and pepper in here, and there may be a few other things that I'm not going to tell you about, or my boss would be very angry with me. But 9 times out of 10, it is kosher salt, and usually the preferred kosher salt is Morton's kosher salt, because we like the size of the crystal in respect to how slowly it melts, which is key for bark formation. So it's usually Morton's kosher salt, 16 mesh black pepper. And what I mean by mesh is when the pepper gets ground, it falls through a screen or a sieve. And the size of that hole in that sieve defines the mesh size of the pepper. 16 mesh, a little finer, which is what we have here. And then there's some other things. It could be garlic. It could be onion. It could be Lowry seasoned salt. It could be any combination thereof. It could even be chili pepper. Chili pepper as well. So it could be a combination of these things, but salt and pepper is the backbone of Texas-based barbecue rub. And I'll go one step further. To quote Wayne Miller, here we go again, Louis Miller barbecue fame, you can see how many times I mentioned them. Wayne calls black pepper the 9th food group. I agree with him. Black pepper is highly important towards what Central Texas barbecue is all about. Yeah, what we're dealing with here is we're dealing with some different temperatures. I like to, and that depends on the type of equipment that you're working with. Here behind us, we have a 1,000 gallon Moberg, and we also have a 1,000 gallon M&M. On these big 1,000 gallon pits, we like to start out, or this is just our preference. There's different folks that do it different ways. Some folks will start very low, around 225, and build into their heat after the muscle group tightens and the salt sets. Then they'll incrementally step up the temperature just past the stall. And then once the product is wrapped, then they'll raise the temperature up. Us, if we're running on these big pits, for which we are today, we'll start at about 250 degrees Fahrenheit and run them until they hit the stall. And that stall is at a specific point. Who all has cooked a brisket, and you start taking the temperature from them, like, why is this doggone thing not rising in temperature? It's been on here for X amount of hours and it ain't going nowhere in respect to internal temperature. That is what we mean by stall. It has hit the brick wall, i.e. the stall, and it ain't going nowhere for a while. That's usually most folks' indicator to wrap and then step on the temperature. But for us, we're operating at about 250 degrees until we wrap. And then when we wrap, that's the protector. And then we'll step on that temperature probably by a good 25 to 30 degrees to push it past that stall and completely render out the internal fat.
Yeah. Well, speaking about the wrapping.
Oh, you want me to bust a rhyme?
Yeah.
No, I can't do that. But what I can do is wrap this brisket. So let's do that real quick, shall we? So there's a lot of different methodologies in respect to wrapping a brisket. I'll show you how we do it here. Now, some folks, what they'll do is they will take the butcher paper. Now, there's a lot of different ways to wrap a brisket. Some folks use foil. I'm not a foil guy, because what happens when you wrap in foil is essentially you're braising the brisket. It will break down the interconnective tissues and it will render fat, but then you run the risk of turning your brisket into pot roast. We don't want that. We want barbecue. Grandma's pot roast is great, but not in this application. So some folks, what they will do is they will spray the butcher paper down with greasy, like rendered brisket fat. Some people use AC vinegar, which is what we're going to use. Will you hand me that container back there?
Yep.
I'll hold the paper. And we don't have to get crazy with it. What we're going to do, and we already got a little bit of grease because the brisket's already been sitting on the paper. So no harm, no foul. We're just going to get it wet, just about that much right there. Then we're going to take our brisket. I like to put my point where it's right here to my left. That usually works pretty good for me. And what we want to do, now the butcher paper is porous. It still breathes, right? But it will protect the brisket and hold in grease and the rendered fat, or the drippings, if you like, another way to call it. It will hold it in there and continue to help it push past the stall without braising it. So that's why the paper is important, because it still has that level of breathability. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move this guy back just a hair, just enough to wrap around that corner, just a hair bit more, just about like that. We're going to tuck them in. Then we're going to tuck this in right here, bring it over. We're going to do this side the same way, just like that. And then we're going to roll them over or flop them over. Move it in, nice and tight. There you go, my friend. Ain't that beautiful?
Yeah.
And now she's wrapped, and now she's protected, and she can go right back on that pit. Now that would be an indicator for me to start stepping on the gas, because it's protected and it's not going to take on any more smoke. It's just not. It can't, because it's wrapped. And if I include more heat to the equation, which means more draft towards that stack, we're not going to fry it. Make sense?
Yeah. Okay, let's go forward. How I know that the brisket is ready?
Well, I can tell you right now that is not ready. See that? I could play basketball with this. Larry Bird with the Boston Celtics back in the day could take that in for a hoop, guaranteed. So if I'm holding that brisket right there and it's that stiff as a board, that tells me that rascal is not ready. Now, if I were to pick this brisket up and it had a droop to it, where I'm putting my finger right here, see where my finger is? And if she starts to droop and my finger will go up in there about an inch or so, I know that I'm moving in the right direction. If I come back here on the thick end of my point and I can push my finger in just ever so slightly, same as I can right here, we're moving in the right direction. Now, if I take my handy dandy thermopin, excuse me while I grab it. Now where we want to, if you're going to use the thermometer, where you want to stick it is right there, right in the division of the point and the flat. What you don't want to do is you don't want to get it all the way up into the flat, because then you're going to hit a quote unquote grease pocket or fat pocket of rendered grease and fat as it's inside that brisket. That will give you a false reading, a higher temperature reading. So you want to get it right there in between the point and the flat, right there. All right. Now, typically the stall ends up happening whenever this muscle group tightens, and I can tell you we're right hot and heavy into the front part of that stall. So I bet you we're somewhere within that 165 degree range. Let's just see, and looky there. Damned if I'm not right. I'm pretty close, aren't I?
160.
160. Damn, I'm good. So anyway, that stall is going to start somewhere within the mid 160s to the mid 170s. And it's going to hang out there for a long time. Generally, there's different schools of thought in respect to where to take that wrap. Some people take it earlier because they want less smoke. Some people take it later. Like, let's say if you probe that here, some folks will want to take that to 185 before they wrap because they want more smoke. It really depends on how much smoke and how much bark you want. But I'm going to say somewhere between 165 and 185 within that 20 degree range is where you want to be. And that depends on you. Now, once you do wrap that, we're going to keep going, and that's going to be our marker once we wrap it, to completely push it over the clip and increase the temperature on this pit. Now we're going to pull this rascal. We're going to feel it by hand. It should feel pretty heavy, and it should be loose and limp without breaking apart. And this part where I showed you, and that part where I showed you there. Now, if you were going to use your handy dandy thermopin, that should be somewhere within about 205 or 200 degrees to 205 degrees Fahrenheit. But you also need to think about hang time, because you cooked a steak. I know you cooked a steak, and you got to think about pulling it just a shade this side, right, of your desired temperature, because whenever you pull any meat, any cut of meat off of any hot surface, be it a steak or otherwise, it will continue to rise in temperature, correct? So you have to think about that. So there's a sweet spot in respect to pull temperature as well. So you have to think about that as well.
Okay. Thank you. I think there was a hell of information about the brisket now. And
well, thank you, my friend. I sure do appreciate it. Thank you guys for stopping out.
Do you have some greetings for the Finnish followers?
Yes, I do. Howdy. Y'all come on out and visit us at Schultz Pit Room. We'd be mighty proud to have you guys, and we'll serve you up some of this mighty fine Texas brisket and sausage and all kinds of other things we have on the menu, and we'll treat you like family. So we hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Oh, wait a minute. Why am I putting it in? Get over here. Put this brisket in there. We're going to put that with the point facing that direction. He wanted to get some video content, guys, so I apologize.